It is the final day of the G7 summit as heads of state gathered at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial for a photo op. Leaders of the leading world economies have held discussions regarding some of the most pressing geopolitical issues, like the war in Ukraine and belligerent China. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also made a surprise visit to Hiroshima on Saturday and met G7 leaders. He is expected to brief leaders today on what Kyiv needs for a ramped-up offensive against Moscow that he has said will create the conditions for resolution to the conflict. Last evening, the leaders of the Quad group, that is Australia, India, Japan and the United States, held a meeting on the sidelines of the G7. The four nations in a joint statement called for peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific maritime domain. Without mentioning China directly, the leaders said that they strongly oppose destabilizing or even unilateral actions that seek to change the status quo in the region by force or even coercion. Meanwhile, a number of bilaterals are also scheduled to take place today, including the one between Japan and South Korea, who are expected to highlight their improved ties amid regional concerns with the joint meeting. U.S. President Joe Biden is also scheduled to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today and hold a joint meeting with the leaders of South Korea and Japan, and that's according to the U.S. officials. The three nations are reportedly expected to discuss ways to deepen their ties, including military interoperability. The countries will also discuss the economic coercion they face from China. The G7 meeting comes amid a shadow of a looming debt crisis and other domestic issues for President Biden, which has led to doubts over the ability of the United States to keep its international commitments. The latter half of his trip post-G7 had to be scrubbed so that President Biden could return to Washington early and resume talks on debt ceiling. White House Bureau Chief and correspondent Patsy Widakuswara is now joining us live from Hiroshima. Hi, Patsy. Good to see you. President Biden is expected to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today. What is the White House saying about this crucial meeting?
Well, certainly this was a surprise. We started hearing rumors that President Volodymyr Zelensky was going to show up in person about a couple of days ago, but the White House was very mum about it, obviously for security reasons. But yes, yesterday afternoon, President Zelensky arrived here in Hiroshima and, as you mentioned, has already met with some G7 leaders. Today, he's meeting with President Biden. And of course, big on the agenda is basically what else can the U.S. and the Western allies do to support Ukraine's fight against Russia. Of course, the biggest thing that has happened was finally President Biden agreed to support efforts by NATO allies to supply Ukraine with F-16s, to train Ukrainian pilots to operate these F-16s. And this is such a big movement, such a big turnaround from the U.S., because for months, President Biden has said no to this request from President Zelensky because of the concerns that this might escalate the war even further. The U.S. has been very adamant about providing Ukraine with only the so-called defensive weapons rather than offensive, which obviously F-16s can be considered offensive. However, U.S. officials have told me that the Ukrainian side has vowed or has promised that they will not use this as an offensive measure towards Russia. Now, this, of course, remains to be seen in the weeks and months of the conflict forward.
Patsy, President Biden is at the summit while there is a wide debate about the debt ceiling crisis back home. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so this has been overshadowing the crisis, as you mentioned. Number one, this is a question about U.S. credibility, right? I mean, this is at a time when the U.S. is trying to rally together its allies to push back against the so-called Chinese economic coercion. There's a lot of instability that could be at play should the U.S. default. And U.S. officials have said that that default date, the so-called X date, could come as early as June 1st, so just a couple of days. And as you said, President Biden postponed his second leg of the trip, which is to Australia for the Quad Summit. They ended up having the Quad Summit here truncated only 30 minutes yesterday afternoon. And also also a brief stop to Papua New Guinea to reach out to Pacific Islanders, again, in the same context of trying to bring them together, trying to shore up alliances to push back against Chinese growing influence in the region. So the question becomes, from the leaders at the G7, can we trust the U.S. to A, be stable, to come together enough politically to be able to sustain, to raise the debt ceiling, to avoid a default, which of course would impact global finance in such a big way, because don't forget that the world is also still recovering from the pandemic. It's also suffering from the impact of the food and energy crisis due to the war in Ukraine, and also the regional bank crisis of several U.S. regional banks collapsing. So these are all very, very crucial economic and geopolitical issues that are impacting the world. And so a lot of questions and a lot of concerns coming from world leaders to Joe Biden, asking about what's going to happen in the U.S. Now, the White House keeps on saying that, you know, they are confident that there's going to be a deal made with the congressional Republicans, that there is no way that the U.S. will default. The line that they keep on saying is that we are not a deadbeat nation. Now, of course, it remains to be seen how far the negotiation can happen and whether or not it will be smooth enough in order to avoid any kind of, negative impact on the stock market and financial systems.
Patsy, finally, let's talk about that surprise Quad mini summit, and leaders of the Quad, which include India, Australia, the US and Japan, held their separate mini summit on the sidelines of the G7 summit. What's being said about President Biden's ability to balance his domestic and also international commitments?
Yeah, so it's the same kind of narrative that's, of course, happening at the G7 on the broader level. And don't forget, it's not just the G7, but also the invitees, the so-called global South, right? India was also part of it, Brazil, Indonesia, South Korea, Comoro, representation from the African Union, and so on, because this is a key issue that Japan is trying to do in order to link up, the pressures, economic pressures from China, geopolitical pressures from Russia on its war in Ukraine, and the impact it has on the global South, and to carry that forward as India will become the chair of the G20. Now, the Quad, of course, is a smaller grouping. It's only 4, US, Japan, India, and Australia. But it's essentially, the same kind of issues, the same kind of regional concerns, but also a lot of really just technical working groups, digital connectivity, maritime domain, supply chain issues. These are all focus in that group. And of course, as you said, the meeting is only half an hour because there were the inability of President Joe Biden to continue to Australia as scheduled. And again, the same questions of whether the U.S. can clean up its house, clean up its domestic issues well enough in order to be able to lead on the world stage, remain credible in the world stage. That is a challenge for President Joe Biden, even though the White House continues to push on the message that, even though our system is messy at times, democracy is still the best system compared to perhaps, authoritarian regimes such as China and Russia, who are, of course, pushing their own propaganda in saying that the U.S. cannot deal with its own messy democracy, and our system of one government, one voice is more effective and makes us a much more reliable ally. And so this is the kind of, big themes that's being discussed here in Hiroshima.
All right, we'll have to end this discussion here. I've been talking to White House Bureau Chief and Correspondent Patsy Widakuswara. Patsy, thank you very much for talking to us today.
My pleasure.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.